daring to answer the question that you've asked, that we've chosen. It's Ask GC Anything. Now, first off the start ramp this week is this question over on Twitter from @TimothyCalvier. He asks, how do you actually sit and find your place on the saddle? #talkback. Attached are some pretty painful looking positions. I must agree with you there. It's a picture of Geraint Thomas slid forward on the saddle, very distinctive style for G, and also a picture of Rowan Dennis as well, very far forward on the saddle. Now, both of those pictures, I can assure you, are of Rowan Dennis and Geraint Thomas going full throttle, flat out, a phrase that we actually call in cycling on the rivet. And that phrase was derived from the fact that many, many years ago, the leather saddles, or the leather on the saddle, was actually held in place by brass and copper rivets, hence sat on the rivet. Now, many riders actually, when they're riding particularly fast and hard, do slide forward on the saddle. And they end up with their pelvis directly over the bottom bracket. And that's the sort of position that many riders adopt when they ride on their TT bikes. And on a TT bike, the saddle is thrust a lot more forward, and therefore you're not quite sat on the tip of the saddle as much as you do on the road. So what we see in the positions with Rowan Dennis there and Geraint Thomas is both of those noted time trialists, in fact, trying to get as far forward on the bike and as efficient as possible to try to replicate their position on TT bikes. Now, as you rightly point out, Timothy, sat in a position on a road bike right on the tip of the saddle for a very long period of time can actually be quite uncomfortable and can cause numbness, although it is efficient. And we've got a few ways you can actually reduce that by watching this video here.
Now, saddles are a very personal thing. A shape which suits one person won't necessarily suit the next person, just like, in fact, any item of clothing which comes in different sizes. Now, what this means, unfortunately, is that experimenting with different saddles can become quite expensive if you buy them each time. So, if at all possible, try to borrow one per week, either from a friend or maybe a local bike shop, until you find the right one for you. And I can say from personal experience that when you do find that right shaped saddle, it makes an enormous difference to the comfort of your riding.
Well, next up on the grid, we have this question in the comments section from B. Huvadia, who asks, my third attempt at the Fred Whitten Challenge is in 6 weeks' time, and I'm not concerned about my finish time, but I definitely don't want to have to do the walk of shame up the hard knot pass again. Is it better to focus on max power without losing weight, I'm 80 kilograms, or to lose about 5 kilograms with the risk of a little bit of reduced power? Well, thanks very much for this. There is a fascinating question. Now, just by way of explanation, the Fred Whitten is a very famous sportive in the north of England, in the Lake District, in fact, and the Hard Knot Pass is a ridiculously steep climb in that particular sportive, which is peppered with other climbs that are similar. But the Hard Knot Pass is over 2.5 k's long, but at its maximum is a quite ridiculously giddy 37% in gradient. So, as you can imagine, losing a bit of weight is definitely going to help you. Now, but I think the one thing you need to consider here, can you become more efficient by staying the same weight and increasing your power, or by losing weight at the compromise or risk of losing a tiny little bit of power? Now, I would say, given the nature of that particular course, and you're aiming to lose 5 kilograms, you're going to lose 6.25% of your body weight, and you are going to become far more efficient, even if you lose just a little bit of power. Because the aim of the game here is to try and increase your power to weight ratio. So losing weight is important. Now, if you're aiming to lose 5 kilograms in a couple of months, make sure you don't do it too soon. Make sure the incremental loss is nice and gradual, and keep an eye on your power as well so it doesn't drop off too much. Now, the big question here, how much difference will 5 kilograms make on a climb? Well, believe it or not, me and Dan tried that very experiment out in the Tour de France in Andorra. Check it out.
Well, Matt and I have come to Andorra on a real-world climb. We're going to do some real-world powers with some different real-world weights and see what the difference is.
Yeah, it's some real GCN does science, and the tests we're going to carry out are as follows. We're going to ride 5k of this climb, 2 runs each. The first run, we're going to have a 5 kilogram rucksack on our backs. We're then going to ride at set power, so I'm going to ride at around 275 watts, and Dan is going to ride at 225 watts. We're then going to have a little bit of a lie down to rest, recuperate, and then do the run again, but this time without the rucksacks, but at the same given power, so 225 and 275.
It's time now for the rapid fire round. First up, we have this on William Bellavance. referring to last week's Ask GCN Anything with special guest scientist / star in the making, Louis Passfield. We had some really good responses to this. And William says, that was the best Ask GCN ever. Thank you, Professor Louis Passfield. 174 likes for that. And again, in relation to last week's Ask GCN Anything, Jordan Stebbins in the comment section, all I can say is fantastic. I'm in school studying exercise science and sports performance, and this was an absolute treat. Wonderful job, GCN. Well, we definitely hope we can get Louis Passfield back in the studio again in the very near future. But moving along rather rapidly, as it is rapid fire, Markai Malarkey has asked, over on Twitter, if you take a banana on your ride as fuel, how do you dispose of the skin? And that is, you'd think, quite an obvious question, but I take a banana on many of my rides, and I must admit, in the countryside, I do throw it into a hedge or just into a field because, of course, banana skins are biodegradable. I do make sure that I take the stickers off before I go on my ride, but I've done some research, as this is Ask GCN Anything, and apparently, get this, depending on environmental factors such as temperature and altitude, it can take nearly 2 years for a banana skin to fully biodegrade. So just bear that in mind. Next up, we have this from James L. Thurlow. At GCN tweet, using this week's or last weekend's Milan San Remo as an example, why do the pros adopt that famous aero pose or lunge when crossing the line? Well, thank you, James, for that. Basically, it's not really an aero pose, it's not really about aerodynamics, it's about in the last few meters of a race, especially in a very close sprint finish, the riders throw their bikes forward in an effort to try and grab that vital millimetre, which in this case, in relation to Michał Kwiatkowski, took him to victory. So it's not really an aerodynamic pose, it's just when they throw the bike forward to try and get across the line a little bit quicker. And finally, in the rapid fire round, this is from Greg Loper. At GCN, if you were Greg van Avermaet, would you trade Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, E3 Harelbeke and Gent Wevelgem for wins in Paris-Roubaix? Now, clearly I'm not Greg van Avermaet, I'm Matt Stevens from GCN, but I guess I would. Back to normal speed now, whatever that may be. And in fact, it's a sprinting question, so scrub that. Back up to sprint speed is this from Andrew Green. For a decided non-sprinter, what's the best position for sprinting? On the hoods or on the drops, standing or sitting? Now, hi Andrew, thanks for getting in touch. As a start point for a non-sprinter, if you're trying to learn how to deliver as much power as you can through the bike, my advice would be on the drops and out of the saddle. It simply is the most mechanically efficient to get as much power out of the bike as possible, especially if you're starting off. Now, there's no harm as you get better at sprinting and more effective in trying to train sprinting whilst in the saddle. And in fact, there are some sprinters who can sprint remarkably effectively and powerfully whilst in the saddle, but generally they're pedaling at a very, very high cadence. And of course, if you look to track sprinters, they generally start their sprints out of the saddle, trying to get as much torque and power through the bike before then settling into the saddle and finishing their sprint. But for the best advice, always look to the pros. One in particular comes to mind, that's Mr. Mark Cavendish.
Right, last one, tip number 5 for any budding sprinters. I think it's the simple one. I think it's what I'm most famous for, and that's keeping low. And to be fair, I always did it naturally. Don't know if it's from the track or just because I'm short legs and short and long bodied, but it's okay that you and do it now. How low he gets is crazy. And there's a massive aerodynamic advantage there, you know. If you're like this, you're really closing the hole here. And if you're sprinting like this, you know, the big hole, the big gaping hole to bring in the air, you know. So keep low, and you're going to accelerate further.
Finally, on this week's Ask GCN Anything, we have this question from Luke Reed. Hey GCN. Hi Luke. I've got 200 miles to ride across 2 days next month. Have you got any tips to keep the mind occupied during the ride? #talkback. Well Luke, thanks very much for getting in contact, and I hope the ride goes well wherever it may be. Now, riding 100 miles by any stretch of the imagination is a fair distance. Now, depending on the sort of terrain, it could be a particularly long day in the saddle, giving you plenty of time to think. Now, in my younger days, when I used to do quite a few miles, especially when I lived in France, I quite often used to imagine I was actually in a race. Well, to be more specific, in a lone break, holding off some of my heroes, and I could go for hours and hours almost in an imaginary, completely imaginary race scenario, and that really did used to motivate me. I used to imagine that the bunch were bearing down on me, so I used to keep riding as hard as I could, and yeah, I've got some very, very fond memories, and that can be a really good way to pass the miles. Another kind of method that I used to use while I was riding, especially when the going got particularly tough, was to think how good this particular training was doing me and how much better it would make me in the future. And one other thing I used to do, especially on longer rides, was actually have a cafe stop. Now I know having cafe stops is quite a controversial topic. Not all of you like to do it, but I did. But I always used to do the cafe stop just over half distance, so I had more than half the ride in the bag. Now there are numerous ways to motivate yourself whilst out on the road, or even if you've got a problem getting out on the road in the first place, 5 of which are in this video.
There were many occasions in the past, especially in the depths of winter, when the weather was foul and the warmth of my bed had far more appeal than the harsh outdoors, when the fact I'd actually arranged to meet a friend beforehand gave me that extra bit of motivation to crawl from my bed and onto my bike. Who would cave in first, me or him? In fact, we used to discuss it later on the ride, describing how each of us would lie in bed, waiting, hoping even, for the other to send a text calling off the ride, but it never came, and we always did the ride. The startling effect of commitment.
Well, that brings to a close another edition of Ask GCN Anything, but please do keep your questions coming on all social media platforms using the hashtag TalkBack, and don't forget the comment section below this video as well. Now, if you haven't already subscribed to GCN, I think you know what to do. So if you haven't done it, why not? Click on the globe, it's absolutely free, and don't forget to tell your mates. And then you will not miss another GCN video. And don't forget to give it a thumbs up as well. Now for 2 more rather cool videos, how about clicking just down here for Simon Richardson's tour of the Taipei bike show, but specifically looking at prototype tech. And if you click down here, you can find another unusual video on how to train for mountains, get this, when you don't live near any.